RPC. Thank you, David. Know that the RPC has been, an influential partner with our state and other local and regional partners in advancing the effort to enhance, the resilience of our coastal communities. Over the last, I would say close to a decade anyway, the RPC has played a pretty prominent role in a lot of initiatives. Probably the more familiar ones are the Coastal Risks and Hazards Commission. My predecessor, Cliff Sinnott, did a fantastic job in chairing that commission and putting out a product that is continuously referenced today. We've had projects that you're probably familiar with, like Tides to Storms, where we worked to estimate potential sea level rise based on the latest climate science, showing the potential impacts from anywhere from 1 to as much as 6 or more feet of sea level rise on our seacoast. We've had the Sea Rise project, which built on Tides to Storms. And what else? We have the high water mark signs that are out on the seacoast in different places to give the public a sense of what all those studies and what those numbers would look like potentially in the future. So, we're still immersed in, that was an intentional pun, we're still immersed in the coastal resilience planning and the sea level rise work. We're currently working on at least 7 projects that I could list off at the top of my head this afternoon when I was putting some thoughts together. 2 of which you're going to hear about tonight: the Coastal Zone Technical Assistance Program, our Transportation Corridor Vulnerability Assessment. We're working with Northampton and Little Boar's Head to do coastal hazards master plan chapters. You have heard from us in the past, we're doing a coastal innovative land use guide to work with communities and provide them model regulations to address coastal resilience. And those will apply not only for the immediate coastal communities, but those, just inland that may have some tidal influence, and potentially even other inland communities. We've played a pretty big role in getting a new hydrodynamic flooding model underway, which I mentioned Tides to Storms earlier, that estimated sea level rise and the flooding impacts from that. But we did that in a sort of a bathtub approach, as if the tide just sort of gently came in and gently went out, and where would the extent of the water be under those various scenarios. What we're doing now is working with the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services and some consulting firms to develop a model that would show what the potential of sea level rise is when you actually add waves, wind, currents, and how that may impact our culverts, our roads, and other areas along the immediate coast. So that's going to be a bit of a game changer as that comes together over the next 1 to 2 years. And we're also kicking off a new, what's called the Flood Smart Seacoast Initiative, where we're working with the town of Hampton to look at the areas that flood routinely. In fact, I'm sure flooded back on just after New Year's with the king tide that we had, to look at those areas that have repeated losses and look at home elevation opportunities for residents where they could, raise their home up on essentially stilts or up out of the flood level, or potentially even be bought out by FEMA. And finally, the last one that we're just getting started on is we're working with the University of New Hampshire, the Civil Engineering Division, to look at the effects of sea level rise on pavement conditions. So there's, like I said, we've been involved in this for a long time, and we continue to be called on to do this type of work. So we'll continue to do so. In fact, we're going to be hopefully, at least helping the Hampton Beach Area Commission as they look at their master plan in the coming months. Whether we actually are part of the project or just supportive in a different way remains to be seen. But lots and lots of work going on, and lots of people getting involved. So what I wanted to do tonight was just look at a couple of these initiatives in a little more detail, and also give you the chance to actually meet Maddie Diono, who is our regional planner, has been here for a year and is yet to get in front of you to share some of the work that she's been doing. We interviewed Maddie on Zoom back when the pandemic hit, and she spent her first 5 months or so, I think, working remotely, maybe longer than that. And and finally is here tonight to share a little bit about what she's working on. And Maddie's taken on a lot of the responsibility of our coastal resilience work, and is going to be taking the lead on a lot of that moving forward. So she'll kick us off with talking about the technical assistance grant, and then we'll follow that up with Dave Walker, our assistant director and lead transportation planner, who's going to bring us up to speed on the transportation corridor vulnerability assessment. So with that, I probably need to give Maddie permission to share her screen, right?
Yes.
All right, Dave, help me out. I've been away from Zoom for too long. I could just make you a co-host. Where are you? There we go.
Oh, I got it.
All right, good.
Well, can you see that?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. I don't know how to get into full screen, but you can see that front slide.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Sorry, I don't know how to get into full screen here. Anyway, hi everyone. I'm Maddie Diano, regional planner for the Rockingham Planning Commission. Like Tim said, I've been here for just over a year now, and I've been involved with some of our coastal resilience planning work. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of some of the work that we've been doing this year through our New Hampshire Coastal Zone Technical Assistance Grant, and where we're headed. So yeah, just for some background, excuse me, RPC receives funding through the New Hampshire, through the New Hampshire Coastal Program. The New Hampshire Coastal Program is one of 34 federally approved coastal programs authorized under the Coastal Zone Management Act. The goal of the program is to provide staff assistance and funding to coastal towns and cities, as well as local and regional groups, to implement projects to help communities become more resilient to natural hazards and flooding events. And this program is administered by New Hampshire DES. So as you can see here, New Hampshire's coastal zone includes 17 municipalities adjacent to the Atlantic Ocean and Piscataqua River, as well as those near the Great Bay and tidal rivers. 12 of those communities fall within RPC's planning area, and 5 fall within the Stratford RPC's planning area. So again, with this funding, we're able to provide technical assistance to our coastal communities in the general areas of climate change adaptation and coastal resilience. So one of the things we've been working on is working with the town of Newcastle on integrating coastal resiliency into their planning efforts, and more specifically into their master plan update. Part of this work has included holding a series of all boards meetings or workshops, which have included discussions on the master plan update and public outreach strategies, presenting the science of coastal impacts to Newcastle officials and departments, reviewing the findings from the Seacoast Transportation Vulnerability Assessment, and discussing potential adaptation strategies and projects to incorporate into the upcoming hazard mitigation plan update. So RPC staff is working with the town on this. The goal of the all boards workshops is to really get everyone in town at the same table to talk about the updated New Hampshire coastal flood risk guidance, as well as the various studies and vulnerability assessments that have been done, and how to better incorporate that into the town's planning efforts and master plan update. So next steps, RPC is working with the master plan subcommittee on drafting a survey, and that's anticipated to be launched in late winter.
Maddie, do you want questions after each segment or just when you're done?
Why don't we just wait till the end, if that works?
That's fine.
Also part of this grant, RPC staff participates in the New Hampshire Coastal Adaptation Work Group. And for those who aren't familiar, this is a collaboration of organizations and towns working on climate change related projects and coastal hazard related projects in the Seacoast region. And part of that participation involves helping to plan the annual climate summit, which takes place in May. Additionally, RPC staff have been reviewing vulnerability assessments, or each of our coastal communities' vulnerability assessments, master plans, I said that, what other ones? Other relevant municipal documents, and pulling out those projects related to climate change adaptation and coastal resilience, with the idea that the RPC can potentially help advance some of those already identified projects and priorities. For example, many towns cite the need for increased public outreach and education related to natural hazard events in town. Others indicate the need for stricter regulations related to coastal flooding and coastal hazards, adopting stricter setbacks or coastal buffers. So these are some of the areas that RPC can work with communities on and help bring some of those already identified projects to the forefront. So we plan to use this information that we've gathered from our review of these municipal documents, and we plan to conduct check-in interviews with each of our coastal communities, just to talk about what the status is of these projects that have already been identified in these municipal documents, and to talk about further what the town's needs and priorities are related to climate adaptation and resilience. So next steps, we are looking to start scheduling those check-in interviews over the next couple of months. And we'll be generating a final report with all of our findings, anticipated to be completed toward the end of June. So stay tuned for that. So that was just a brief overview of what we've been working on this year through our coastal program technical assistance grant. I'm happy to take any questions.
Did you receive any pushback at all
Any pushback for which part?
relative to what you were offering? Were they receptive?
In Newcastle?
Yes.
I believe so. My colleague Jen Rowden was the project lead on that, but I believe the all boards meetings were very well received.
Good to hear.
And I guess one thing I would add to what Maddie was showing you there is that the idea behind looking at the hazard mitigation plans, master plans, vulnerability assessments is that there's been a lot of good work done over the years. And sometimes, as you all know, planning documents tend to get shelved and not advanced. So what we're trying to do is, it's almost like I'm trying to mirror the transportation planning process, where we have more of a collaborative, continuous type of approach, where we're going back, we're looking at what we have on the table, what we could potentially implement, and then use this technical assistance grant that we get annually right now from the coastal zone program to make sure we're sort of moving the needle rather than just having the plans. We want to try to find opportunities that we've already identified, and where there's the will in the community to help the community work on that, whether that, as Maddie said, is it just an education outreach component for the community, or if they want to work on something more regulatory in nature, we can step in and then help them with either of those. So I'm hoping that this model that we're sort of trying to apply to this grant will work well, and so far, as Richard, everyone has been pretty receptive.
Good to hear.
Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, I have a question. This is Ravi from Seabrook. Now, we probably will start redoing our master plan starting from later this year, perhaps. How would we connect with you on that? Because clearly we want to make sure that the master plan covers this area.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, first of all, just by saying what you said is a good start, because now we're aware that you're thinking about starting that work, and we can certainly help out. We are actually going to be at the planning board. I think Maddie will be there along with Jen Rowden on Monday the 17th. So that's this coming Monday. We're coming in with the Jay Diener he's from Hampton, but he's there to talk about some of the work that's going on in Hampton and see if Seabrook is interested in emulating a similar process. But in that same conversation, I think what we need to do is talk a little bit about the idea of an all boards meeting and an all boards approach, similar to what we're doing in Newcastle, and work with, where we can bring multiple partners to the table. And if you're thinking about doing your master plan between the coastal program, UNH Cooperative Extension, the RPC, and others, we can probably find a way to help you with that, not only financially, but technically in terms of having the right experts help you out.
Does the holiday interfere with what you're going to do?
As far as I know, they're meeting and we're going in.
Good, good.
So it's a good.
I know the focus here is the coastal planning, but I believe that there are multiple topics that master plans will touch or cover that will go beyond the town boundaries. For example, aquifer management, perhaps, right?
Sure.
Things like that. So I was wondering, if we have a checklist of those different areas in which the master plan processes from the different towns need to look to collaborating with the RPC.
I don't know that there's a formal checklist, and I know there's a couple more land use planners on here, more so than I, but I don't know if there's a formal checklist that requires regional or neighborly collaboration. I mean, there's the requirements of what needs to go into a master plan at the bare minimum. But I think the idea of being proactive and thinking regionally and communicating with your neighbors about things like aquifers is really, one, is a good idea, but also it's really dependent upon the individual community. If you wanted to take your master plan in that direction and, communicate, have outreach with the neighbors that share a resource, or if you even it's just thinking transportation, you want to talk with, Hampton and your neighbors in that sense, then it makes a lot of sense to approach it in that way and invite them in to potentially, provide you with input as to what they're doing.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? This is Tricia from Raymond.
Yeah.
So most of this topic is focused coastal, but it's from your bathtub analogy would be the ocean in, the sea in. Is any of this being discussed about, instead of ocean in, water coming down to the ocean, so that line of where the waterways, the Lamprey watersheds and others that come down into the Great Bay are addressed? Because we know salt, we know road debris and other things that come down, and how climate change upstream coming down to the waterways down, the impact it has on plants, and that's erosion, and then what does that cause for other problems? Is there anything being done the other direction?
So I think the best thing I have for that at this point is, yes, but what we're trying to do is part of the coastal land use guide project that I mentioned in my introduction. One of the tasks in there is to develop a framework for a regional sustainability resilience coordinator position that would help focus that and make that connection and tie in the coastal work we're doing with all of our inland communities, because you're correct. There's impacts, whether the climate, whatever severe weather, there's impacts there that have an impact on the upland communities as well as those down on the coast. So we're going to try to address that in a more formal way through that position. But in the meantime, a lot of our other environmental planning work does try to address that through either source water protection grants through DES or other related work that we do. So it's not ignored. I'm just trying to formalize it into a program within the RPC.
Thank you.
I have a
Barbara.
question. Can you?
Oh,
Oh,
I saw Barbara first, Peter.
that's fine. That's fine.
That's right. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Barbara. It's all right.
Come on now,
Okay,
children.
Peter. Okay, thank you.
Children.
This work is so much needed. I spoke today with someone in state government planning, and without saying who or what, just recognizing that there isn't really very much work being done in the state that relates to resilience. It's kind of new for New Hampshire, although other parts of the country are well into the research and the development of planning and remedies. So I just think that I'm assuming, Tim, that that's kind of part of the concept, because you really need to look ahead. I mean, it's not a picture of 2022. It's a picture that goes decades beyond that. And if you can accomplish that and bring that realization and focus, I think that would be tremendous value.
That is part of the goal, and I don't want to get us off on a sidetrack, but the whole concept of resilience, I think the whole pandemic and COVID brought us to a whole new level of economic resilience, and realizing that we need to think of that as well. So there's a lot there in that word, and something that we're definitely focused on.
Peter.
Yeah, I agree with Barbara. This is really important work. And I think what Robbie had to say about the regional work is really important as well, because a lot of this stuff does cross city boundaries. I know you guys are doing it, city and town boundaries. I know you guys are doing it with what we're going to hear from Dave in a little bit, so that's great. I had a question a little bit about groundwater, and if you're looking at groundwater impacts on the coast, we started to look at them a little bit in Portsmouth and want to do more with that, but are having a little trouble with funding to do that. But just letting people know where they're going to see impacts in their basements, basement flooding. A lot of the flooding we see is in the ground right now, and it'll come over the seawalls and banks soon. But the immediate impacts, it seems like, are groundwater, not only to people's basements, but our city infrastructure, sewer and water, and how to prioritize that based on what's going to flood first. So we really need some good understanding of how groundwater flows with the sea level rise. And I don't know if you guys looked at that at all.
I'm sure Jane Knott is, I think, the expert around here at UNH. On the pavement project that I mentioned, well, it's focused almost exclusively on the impacts to roadway infrastructure. That project is looking a little bit deeper at the groundwater influence from sea level rise on pavement and the roadways near the coast. So there's a start. But I do recognize, I know we were involved at some point with Strawberry Bank and the work that they're doing there. So yeah, we need to do more of that and continue to think about what that means. And also for drinking water and wells, I know there's been some work in Newmarket outside our region. But the Moody Point, I think it's called, in Newmarket, is a community that's on Great Bay that had rising salinity in their wells, and it was attributed to rising seawater ultimately getting into the aquifer and contaminating their wells as they, sort of think of like a condo type community, detached and attached condos, multiple wells drawing water, fresh water out of the ground right next to Great Bay, essentially created a vacuum, right? And it essentially allowed that push of seawater up into the area, and it's being compounded by, the 6 or 8 inches over the last 100 years of sea level rise.
Yeah, it's sort of the hidden threat we don't really think about, but that's great. I'm glad you're looking at it too.
All right, we can switch over to David. If he's
Yeah.
ready.
David's ready.
Take it away, David.
Okay, let me just take a second here to share my screen. Actually, I think Maddie needs to maybe stop sharing hers.
She did.
Did she?
Chief youngsters.
All right. There we go. All right.
You're in that. mixed
Everybody's-
mode, you know.
Are you seeing the correct view there instead of the presenter view?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll just jump right in, I guess. Again, Dave Walker, Assistant Director, Transportation Program Manager. I am the project manager for the Seacoast Transportation Corridor Vulnerability Assessment that we have been doing for about the last 2 or probably approaching 3 years now,
Yeah.
and are getting pretty close to wrapping up. And we're due to be finished up with that in March of this year. So coming right up at the end. So I'm going to step through some different pieces of this, kind of summarize the project. Some of you have heard this before, but I'm going to summarize the project and sort of the process that we've used, talk briefly about both some general and maybe some more specific transportation network impacts, and then talk about the conceptual adaptation options that we're coming up with and the timeframes that we're looking at, and then get a little bit into next steps. I've sort of set a break point in between each of these for questions. So if we can hold any questions you might have to the break point, because I don't know that I'm going to be able to see anybody raise their hand or anything, just because I'm not that coordinated to be able to do 2 things at once. So, so yeah, there'll be points in the middle here where we can stop and see if anybody has questions. So as I stated, we started this project back in 2019. It is a partnership with all the coastal communities, the New Hampshire Department of Transportation, the Coastal Zone Program, University of New Hampshire, and it's funded through a NOAA Project of Special Merit grant. Our goal is to, we have several goals to assess the impact of projected sea level rise under a number of different sea level rise scenarios. And through that, evaluate what that means to the transportation network in terms of changing traffic patterns and traffic volumes and what it might mean for roadway capacity in some cases. We want to be able to identify and prioritize the locations that are impacted by flooding and set things up for further evaluation. And we want to try to identify adaptation and resilience strategies that we can use at those priority locations going forward. And then another side bit of this is that we're trying to incorporate and improve the RPC decision-making process around transportation projects to better take into account the need for resiliency and resiliency planning. So from planning side, the outcomes that we're looking to get are sort of an enhanced understanding of the transportation network and the risks that are there from coastal flooding. Identify what the critical links on the network are in the coastal area and what the impacts of closures to those links means to the transportation network. Ideally, we would come out of this with some improvement concepts as well as some costs for making the improvements to the priority locations, so we could have a better understanding of the scale and scope of what we're attempting to do by addressing resilience along the coast here for the transportation network. We will certainly come out of this with a lot of data and analysis available for other projects going forward. And hopefully as well, we'll see some, identify some policies that we can put into place that will help facilitate a more resilient transportation system. A couple notes about data here. A lot of this information that we're using is based on LiDAR data, light detection and ranging data from 2011. That gives us our most accurate look at elevations of different things. So, but that data is not 100% accurate, or maybe that's the wrong way to phrase that. It is not entirely accurate. There's any given point might have a plus or minus 6 inches. So it might be 6 inches higher than you think, or 6 inches lower than you think, or anywhere sort of in between. And then horizontally, it's about 13 feet in any direction that point could actually be. So while in many cases, this doesn't mean a lot, you know, if we're looking at in areas in the middle where, you know, where there's certainly water within 13 feet of that, it's not an issue. Where it becomes a problem or where we could maybe be saying things that are not entirely accurate is on the edges. and places where the, you know, sort of the fringes. So, you know, we may be saying based on this data that something is underwater when at a certain level of sea level rise, when in actuality, it may not quite be. Or it may be that we're saying something isn't underwater, but it actually is. So it's just along those edges, we just have to be a little careful. The other, one of the major components of what we're using our travel demand model to do a lot of the work for this project. And there's some sort of big caveats that we have to sort of throw out there related to that. One, the model is really intended to look at big picture travel movement and patterns. And so when we start to look at individual links on the network, we can sometimes see some really odd outcomes, and maybe they don't make sense logically at the very individual link level. So we just have to keep that in mind a little bit. The model includes a lot of local roadways, but not all of them. And it includes all state highways. And you can see here on this map that I'm showing on the left side, this is Northampton kind of in the center of the map. You see we include Route 111, we include 1A, and this is Woodland Road and Mill Road. But you can see there's a lot of those local smaller roadways that are not included in the model. And so that comes into play when we're talking about alternate routes and rerouting traffic. Sometimes, you know, a logical alternate route might be there that just isn't in our model. So we haven't assessed that at this point. So the model works by essentially aggregating land use into zones and then loading that information on to the transportation network. And so houses create traffic and businesses and that types of thing receive the traffic. And the number of trips generated by those houses is loaded onto the network via what's called a load link. And you can see those are the purple lines here connected to the roads. So a whole zone, which might be this area between these two roads, is loaded on in two locations. Depending on where those load links are connecting and where flooding might be occurring, we can get some odd patterns there as well, where you see traffic in an area where it's actually closed or due to flooding, or you see a road that's empty of traffic that should have traffic on it. And a lot of that is because of where the traffic is being loaded onto the network. And it's just things that we need to keep in mind as we're going through this analysis. And we can point them out. We can say, well, yes, we realize that the load link maybe is creating an issue here or showing an area that's empty of traffic when it shouldn't be, that kind of thing. So, and then the final caveat I'll give you about the traffic model is that, and as I think I've said in 4 other ways on this slide, it sometimes creates efficient routes that defy what you might think you see in real life. So we just, you know, again, keeping all those things in mind as we go through this. So the work that we did for this project is really based a lot on the tides to storms work that was done starting back in 2015, the Coastal Risk and Hazard Commission that Tim mentioned earlier, and then also the 2020 New Hampshire Science Summary that talks about the coastal flooding risk. And all those pieces sort of really form the basis of the analysis. And so that gives us the data that we're using on the environmental side, on the water side, basically, of things, as where will the water be at certain levels of sea level rise. We're combining that with our travel demand model, which looks at regional traffic patterns from residential and employment distribution. And as I said, includes all the roadways, all the state roadways, and many of the local roads, but not all of them. And so we overlaid our travel demand model on top of the sea level rise data to have a better understanding of what the impacts are on the transportation network of sea level rise. And from that, we were able to identify areas where water and roads intersect. And those are under the map I'm showing on the right side of the screen shows the impacted areas under the 4-foot sea level rise scenario. And you can see they're largely along the coast, but they are also moving inland a little bit into Exeter and Stratham even. So identifying those segments where water and roads intersect at each scenario level. So at 1 feet of sea level rise, we actually have only 4 model lengths that are impacted. That's about a half mile of road in total. As we get closer to 2 feet, that expands out to 13 model lengths and about a mile total of roadway impacted. At 4 feet, we see a real exponential growth here out to 126 model lengths and about almost 17 miles of roadway impacted. And then at the largest scenario that we were looking at, the 6.3 foot scenario, it's double that again or more at 260 model lengths and 28 miles of road. So pretty substantial impacts, again, as we get higher and higher sea level rise, which makes a lot of sense. Rather than trying to work with individual links, though, as sometimes these links are very short or sometimes they're very long, we looked at the areas that were impacted, and we combined those adjacent links that are impacted into single sites. So at the 1 foot scenario, we had 4 model links impacted, and that's 3 different locations. And again, as you go through this, at almost 2 feet, we're at 13 model links in 5 locations. 4 feet, we're at 26 model links but that compresses to 25 locations. And you can see some of those on the screen here. This is looking at a portion of Rye where site 10, for instance, it's 5 model links, but we're considering it 1 site. 6 model links at site 11, but it's one site because it's shared source of flooding or adjacent links that are impacted. So it made a lot of sense. Once we hit the 6 foot level, though, again, way out at 260 model links, that's over 50 locations. So that gets to be a lot to look at. So part of the job that we were doing was to try to prioritize these sites for evaluation. We did not have the resources to look at every single site in the depth that it needs at this point. So we took the number of sites that we found at the 4 foot sea level rise and prioritized them so that we could look at about the top 10 candidate sites to assemble site profiles for those and develop conceptual design, or not conceptual design alternatives, but adaptation options and that kind of thing. Each of those 10 sites we're applying the coastal flood risk guidance to as well. And then we're selecting 2 of those 10 sites for a sort of a little bit more in-depth analysis with the assistance of our UNH researchers. And so this list, we developed a preliminary list of 10 sites amongst the study team. We sent that list to DOT and had a conversation with them about, and as well as some other partners about what was on that list and which sites we should be looking at. And then we came up with a final list from that. And here are the 10 sites that we elected to look at for evaluation. There's my apologies. Jeez, all over the place here. Not quite sure what happened there. So there's one site that actually straddles Newcastle and Rye town boundaries here on Wentworth Road, Route 1B. It's actually these 3 individual sites that we grouped together because they're sort of a same kind. We looked at several segments in Rye, Marsh Road and Parsons Road in Rye, as well as the Ocean Boulevard Wallace Road area in Rye and the Lock Road Ocean Boulevard area in Rye. Hampton, looking at Cusack Road and High Street, as well as where Winnicott connects with Route 1A. And then the Brown Avenue, Church Street, Glade Path, Highland Ave, Route 101, that area where Route 101 comes in and connects to Hampton Beach. And then Route 1 in Hampton, and then in Seabrook, looking at South Main Street and Route 286 there. The 2 road locations highlighted in orange, those are the 2 spots that were chosen for the in-depth analysis. And I'll talk a little bit more about them a little bit later on. So I'll take a moment here to see if anybody has any questions on what I've said so far.
A question.
Yes, Valerie.
I didn't really, you were showing actually my neighborhood in Northampton when you were talking about the loading and all of that, but I didn't
Yep.
quite understand what you meant about the loading, because where I saw those lines, there's no roads there. I didn't think.
Right. Yep.
So I obviously don't get it.
Yep. That's okay. It's travel demand model is kind of a, I don't know, it's a witchcraft kind of thing. So traffic loads onto the transportation network in reality by individual driveways, right? Everybody has an individual driveway. We can't model individual driveways. We just don't have the computing power or resources to do that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So the way that has evolved over time is that you take the land use in a particular zone and you break your region into zones, and there might be half a dozen or a dozen different zones in each community, depends on the density and size of the community, that kind of thing. I think we have 280 zones in our model, right? So you break your region into zones and you load the traffic that would be generated from the land use in that zone onto a couple or 3 points on your transportation network.
All right.
So rather than disaggregating it and adding the traffic from each individual driveway, we take all those driveways, add them up basically, and say, okay, this area is going to generate this amount of traffic, and we load it onto a couple points in the network.
Okay.
And you can see how that might create some problems occasionally, depending on where it's loaded on the network exactly. And so it's just not an exact science. And so we find occasionally that because we decided to load, for instance, this section where we have 111 coming into 1A, mm-hmm. No traffic is loaded directly onto the network there. It's loaded onto Woodland and it's loaded onto 1A, but not onto 111. And so it just creates, like, if you look, and when I show you maybe some of the screens showing some of the model analysis later on, it may show that there's zero traffic on that section of Route 111. We know that's not the case.
I see that out my window every day. That is not the case.
Yeah. Right. So we know that that's not the case. So we just have to account for it in our narrative and say, well, the model loaded this because of where the load links were. It just ignored this link, and we know that, and we know that there would actually be traffic here. So we're trying to account for those things. So
okay, thank you.
Sure.
David, I have a question.
Absolutely.
So in these scenarios, you have 1 foot, 4 foot, and so forth. Are these ocean level rises that you are developing these scenarios for bathtub model or wave action model?
It's the bathtub model. So yeah, we did 1 foot, 1.7 feet, 4 feet, and 6.3 feet. Those are based on the results of both tides to storms and the Coastal Risk and Hazard Commission analyses, and that's where those numbers came from. But the only hydrodynamic model that we have in New Hampshire right now is a bathtub model. So basically everything comes up to a certain level and it stays there and ignores the wave action. Tim mentioned earlier that there is in progress, the state is developing a hydrodynamic model now. It may make sense for us in the future to sort of go back and revisit this analysis using a hydrodynamic model, because my guess is that it's going to change. We're going to find areas that we didn't see based on the bathtub model that are impacted by wave action. So that's something that'll need to be taken into account.
And these are just using only one hazard mode. By that I mean coastal flooding and how that affects the roadways and hence how it affects the traffic. But there could be multi-mode hazards. For example, there is an evacuation necessitated by, say, some nuclear power plant that we have in our backyard, plus coastal flooding like the Fukushima type of thing. When would how would you look at those things where you can have multiple hazard modes happen one on top of the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could probably, with using the model, develop a scenario that had that kind of thing, where you have multiple hazards. Our goal in this particular study was to look at, at each of these levels of sea level rise, we're talking about day-to-day flooding. Every day, high tide is going to overtop in certain areas, certain areas of the road. So how do you adjust for that versus a sort of an emergency kind of situation where you have a hurricane come through and creates, a short-term disruption in the network, potentially other hazards as well, but at least of short-term disruption. And so we were kind of looking at the long-term kind of disruptions of gradual sea level rise.
This would be like an everyday, twice a day event with high tides, right? That's what this was intended to look at. I will tell you, Ravi, the hydrodynamic model will have the capability of looking at simulated storm events. So you could look at a tropical storm, you could look at a winter storm, and under certain scenarios and see what the potential impact would be from those. And then again, plan for those maybe worst case scenarios or most likely scenarios, which would be probably the thing you would plan for. But so there's a lot more coming, and Dave's right. I think we're learning a lot about how to do this type of analysis through this effort, and our travel demand model is getting improved to handle it better, to address some of the questions that Valerie had.
Yeah.
So I think when we get to the point where we have a hydrodynamic model, we'll continue to work with the state partners to improve and build on this analysis.
Thank you.
Dave, Tim, have
Yep.
any of you ever heard of Ocean Lab?
Did you say
Ocean
Ocean
Lab.
Lab?
Ocean Lab is a mobile classroom. Patrick Flanagan is who had originally started that. And for education, it would be an outstanding way to bring in, but also the research they do, it's pretty phenomenal to go and see the models that they've created. And also they do it for the ocean around the globe, and they have live interactive feedback coming in. But he's located in Massachusetts. And I don't know if he only works out of Massachusetts now. And they also work with Woods Hole, but his classroom is mobile, and the data that comes through his classroom is global. And all of the experiments that they do, they can do it as a mobile lab unit, and it's called Ocean Lab. If any of you have some time to get in contact, he's actually phenomenal.
Where's he located, Chris?
I'm sorry, what?
Where's he located, Chris?
It's called Ocean Lab. And it's a mobile classroom. The classroom is able to be taken wherever he needs it to go.
Gotcha.
So.
Cool. Yeah, something we can look into for sure. And but I am not. It doesn't ring a bell with me. I don't know if I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, I had a mobile classroom and we did STEM, and they work with all the universities across the country, and they are able to upload data. And he was specific into climate change and coastal areas. And as I said, his lab is actually quite fantastic to have come in and take a look at, and also to be able to be interactive with data daily. I can send you the link if you guys are interested.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Right.
Dave,
Great.
I don't see anyone else if you want to move on to your
All
next section.
Okay, I'm going to plow into the looking at the transportation impacts. So as you said, we're building on taking this previous work, overlaying our travel demand model on it, and we're looking at the impacts on the transportation system. There are really two different types of impacts. There's the direct network impacts on those links that are inundated with water, those areas that are isolated due to that inundation, and as well as those sort of, the physical impacts to the infrastructure of the flooding, from the flooding. And then there's the indirect impacts. What happens to the changes, how do travel patterns change? What does this mean when you add 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 more cars to a different, to a local road, that kind of thing. And so we're looking at impacts on capacity and condition of different roadways. So looking at from left to right, these are the expected areas that we're expecting inundation from sea level rise at each scenario. So at the 1 foot, we just have the 3 sites, 2 in Hampton, 1 in Rye. At 1.7 feet, it expands to 4 sites, 3 of which are in Hampton, and 1 remains in Rye. At 4 feet, we expand out to 25 sites. And then, we can see a lot of Rye is impacted in Portsmouth, Newcastle. Seabrook begins to be impacted, and we start to see inland impacts both on Route 1 in Hampton, Route 1 in Portsmouth, and then even over on in Stratham, the Squamscott Road in Stratham, and then on Water Street in Exeter down by the Swayze Parkway. At 6.3 feet, that expands even further, and a lot of these sections actually start connecting together to each other. And you can see that we just, expanding out again, doubling in the number of sites that are impacted. And then, so when we do the travel demand model analysis at each, under each scenario, we can see what are the impacts on the roadway network. And on these maps, if the road is sort of blue or light blue, that means it's seeing a reduction in traffic, with the darkest blue being, an empty road. And if it's red or orange, it's seeing an increase in traffic. And so you can see under the 1 foot sea level rise scenario, we have some, or based around the sites that are impacted, one of which is in Rye, we see some localized impacts around Marsh Road and Parsons Road in Rye where the closure is occurring. We see some traffic moving further south and using Route 1A to loop around and using Brackett Road to kind of get around that closure, right? In Hampton, we have a couple of locations, High Street, and then the 101 Route 1 interchange or 1A interchange area are starting to be impacted. So we start to see reductions in traffic on those 2 areas. We see traffic utilizing Winnacunnet Road. We see traffic using North Shore Road and Woodland Road to try to move around those closures. At 1.7 feet, you start to see more of a sort of regional ripple effect as it gets more challenging to get to the beach via Route 101 in Hampton, because again, you've got closures on Route on 101 inbound, and you've got closures on High Street and Cusack Road in Hampton. You start to see traffic moving further away to get to the beach. And again, you're still seeing a lot of use on Winnacunnet Road here in the middle, but you also starting to see increases in traffic on Route 286 down in Seabrook. And so people are trying to find alternate routes around that. You're also starting to see traffic moving through some of these back roads in Rye to try to get to the beach area as well. So we're starting to see, a little broader impact. At the 4 foot sea level rise stage, you can see all these blue links are all roads that are empty because they're closed, with the exception, again, here, as we talked earlier about this end of Route 111, which we know is because of where the traffic is loaded on the links. But you see, basically, there's just a handful of ways to get to the beach. The only way to get to the beach from Hampton south is via North Shore Road. You can get to the beach in Northampton using 111, but you can't go south from there because it's closed by Northampton State Beach Park. And you can only go as far north as like Lock Road area, Hampton, Rye Harbor area, because it's closed there as well. Oh, yeah, sorry. Gosh, very sensitive mouse here. So you start to see these ripple effects. You see the closure of Route 1 here through the Hampton Marsh, which is pushing traffic up Route 88 through Brown Avenue and Toll Farm Road back into Hampton. So we see a similar impact here on Route 1 in Portsmouth, which is closed in this area. And so Greenleaf Boulevard and Beverly Hill Road become the way for people to get around. We see an increase in traffic on Sagamore Road, nothing on, only localized traffic on Route 1B, because essentially Newcastle Avenue becomes inaccessible at 4 feet of sea level rise. And so, you know, just broadly, we're seeing traffic moving away from the coast and using alternate routes from what it's using now. This makes the assumption, of course, that all other things being equal, people are still wanting to get to these locations. The reality is, if these were all closed, you know, if you couldn't get to Hampton Beach would not be a destination any longer, right? So you may also notice that there's no 6 foot sea level rise model run on here. And that is because our model essentially, that number of closed links in our model, they basically broke it. And the model would not run. There's just too many impacts. And so, which, you know, that's not the ideal outcome, but it's, I think, telling in that, you know, the model is basically saying your transportation system doesn't work. And at 6 feet of sea level rise, I think that's essentially what it means for the Seacoast, is that our transportation network will not work as things stand right now. So, looking specifically at just a couple of spots, I'm just going to touch on 2 different things here, or maybe 3. At 1 feet of sea level rise, 1 foot of sea level rise, we have 3 locations that are impacted. We have Marsh Road and Rye. Again, it's very sort of localized kind of impacts of traffic, moves around it to utilize some adjacent roads to get to the same locations. In Hampton, we have High Street that is closed due to the flooding, right? Again, it's pretty close to where it connects to Route 1A. And we have Highland Avenue, which is the inbound piece of Route 101 as it comes into Hampton Beach. And so by closing those 2 roads, we start to shift traffic around a little bit. We see a big shift of traffic to Brown Avenue. So instead of going directly into the beach on 101, traffic turns onto Brown Avenue. A lot of traffic does that already, but more traffic would do that. It would probably close to double the amount of traffic on that road right now. Same thing with Winnacunnet. Winnacunnet becomes the way to get to the beach to the north. And so we see a pretty substantial, we would expect to see a pretty substantial increase in traffic on Winnacunnet, upwards of 6,000 cars a day on average. Summertime volumes, you might see double that kind of thing. So, you know, pretty substantial increases. So we need to think about, you know, what are the impacts? Can those roads handle that sort of volume? What does that mean for driveway access? What does it mean for safety? Those kinds of things. Island Path, which is connects Brown Avenue to Ashworth, is not in our model, but we'd expect to see a large increase in traffic on that as well. We also see a lot of traffic using Woodland and North Shore Road here on the northern end of Hampton to get to both the beach and then connecting to up to 111 and moving towards the coast that way. At 1.7 feet, we see the closure at Marsh Road really, that expands out to include Parsons Road as well. So we get a more of a broad closure there. And so we see the same essential traffic pattern of traffic just sort of moving around that to get around any closures. The expansion of the flooding on 101 includes now the outbound leg, which, you know, Church Street, and includes a portion of Brown Avenue as well. So we start to see it become, and that's part of the reason why we see traffic shifting down to Route 286 in Seabrook, is because suddenly you can't get to the coast using 101 anymore. And so that starts to impact it. Again, we see traffic moving to Winnacunnet, but also down to Route 286 in Seabrook. We would expect almost a 50% increase of traffic on Route 286, which would bring that up to about 20 to 25,000 vehicles a day, which would have impacts not only on safety of that road. It is a pretty high speed, Driveway access becomes more of a problem, as does any side road access that isn't signalized. It's going to be hard to get in and out, making left turns, that kind of thing will be a struggle at that level of traffic. And so we, again, as I had said earlier, we're starting to see that sort of broader ripple effect away from the coast. And finally, when we look at the 4 feet, I forgot to change my, or this is just looking again at that, a little closer look at the 1.7 foot, where we're talking about the traffic moving around and using Route 286 to get to the coast instead of going directly into Hampton Beach. So, and all that information I just gave you from the last slide is right here. So, when we look at the 4 feet, I'm going to break this into sort of 2 pieces, looking at sort of the north and then the south. 4 feet, you can see large number of closures. Each of these sort of gates is an area that is anticipated to be closed due to flooding. And this is where we start to see the impacts in downtown Portsmouth, particularly around South Mill Pond area, Prescott Park, Newcastle Avenue is inundated in several locations. So that's inaccessible at that point. We have the 3 parts of Route 1B on the south end of Route 1B that are impacted, both in Newcastle here near Pit Lane, and the 2 spots in Rye that makes it impossible to use the road to get to Newcastle. We have additional impacts along Route 1A, all up and down the coast here, a large number in Rye. We have Brackett Road in Rye getting closed to traffic. We have Rye Harbor being inaccessible, Lock Road closed, so pretty substantial expansion there. Squamscott Road over in Stratham, and then part of Water Street in Exeter is also impacted. So we end up having a number of neighborhoods and areas that are currently in wide use on the coast, inaccessible by road, or accessible only through sort of convoluted use of side back roads and that kind of thing. So it can be it'll be problematic for continuing things as they are now. When we look at the southern part of the Route 1A corridor, and so Hampton Falls, and Seabrook here, really North Shore Drive becomes the only way to access the coast in Hampton and south. We have Route 1 closed through the Hampton Marsh, and so we can see again that pattern of traffic moving around using some of the back roads to get between Hampton and Hampton Falls and points south. We have Ashworth Avenue impacted in multiple locations, making that not a route that can be used. Route 286 closed where it crosses the Blackwater River there by the Brown's Fishbound there and Markey's, that area. We have South Main Street in Seabrook impacted as well. So essentially you cannot get to the coast in Hampton Beach or Seabrook via the existing roadway network. And then even Winnacunnet Road, which was sort of the workhorse at lower levels of sea level rise, becomes inaccessible as that gets impacted right near where it connects with Route 1A, and even parts of Route 1A in that area are impacted as well. So you really start to see the coast segmented into areas that are accessible and inaccessible. And again, we have a number of neighborhoods that are just not accessible anymore. Anything along the beach here in Seabrook or Hampton is almost all of it is inaccessible. So questions on that piece of it? I know that was really quick run through a lot of information.
Right now, the beach is closed.
4 feet of sea level rise, the beach may just be closed. Yeah.
I have a question, David.
Yeah, sure. Al.
So what are the neighbors saying about the increase in traffic through their neighborhood? You talk with anybody about that?
Well, I've been going out to the communities to talk to town administrators, public works folks, emergency management personnel, those kind of folks. And they've been concerned about it. you know, and you know, and rightly so. You know, I'm throwing a lot of information at them, but we've had one-on-one conversations with folks in Portsmouth, Northampton, Seabrook, and let's see, Rye is next week and Hampton is next week. And I'm forgetting somebody, Newcastle. We had Newcastle, I met with them as well. And a lot of concerns, especially, you know, places where they recognize that there's going to potentially be segments, neighborhoods that are isolated. And you know, Northampton in particular was concerned about the increased traffic on Woodland Road, as that road is kind of windy and narrow, no real shoulder to speak of. So, you know, if you start to double or triple the amount of traffic on that, that can kind of create some problems.
Sure.
One thing I wanted to add to that, just for everyone to think about, it's like, so what we're talking about here is 2 high tides a day, right? So we're not talking that the road's underwater for 24 hours and closed in that sense. It's tide comes in, tide goes out. What we don't know necessarily is how the infrastructure will withstand that repeatedly. The other thing we got to keep in mind is it's not, you know, we're not going to wake up one day to 4 feet of sea level rise. This is going to be a gradual process to get there.
Yep.
So what we're trying to give a sense of, I think, is not so much that the beach is closed, is that when we have these, when and if and when this all starts to take place, we got to think about, you know, one, how to either fortify or abandon these links that and sites that Dave is talking about. I think he's going to get into that a little bit next. And then if we can't do that, then what, how, you know, what's the impact, Al? But I think the reality of it is for those people that might have more traffic on their road because of this, Al, life isn't going to really be the same if this comes to fruition. So I'm not so sure they're going to just wake up like nothing else is going on and suddenly there's more traffic on their road and they're going to come out shaking their fist. I think there's going to be a greater realization that there's a bigger problem.
Right. And from a modeling perspective, we have to model the road as either on or off. We can't just say it's on or off a couple of times a day. We have to say it either works or it doesn't. And I think the reality is if your road is getting flooded twice a day, every day, you know, what is our capacity to maintain that road in working condition over long periods of time of seeing that daily flooding? And I think that's a big question that's out there. And so I think that's kind of how the approach that we're taking is that, well, you know, can you keep those roads open? And I think the question may be in some cases, yes, and others, no. And the other thing I think to keep in mind is that, yeah, some roads might actually be underwater all the time. There are a couple of places where, you know, if it's underwater at 1 foot of sea level rise, you know, if we're hitting 4 feet of sea level rise, I think that means pretty substantial amounts of time every day where that road may be impassable.
That's a good point.
Because that's a full 3 feet of water on top of it, at least. So anyways, any other questions or should I just, you know, continue forward?
Yeah, I have
David?
something. I have something to say. Hello.
Yeah, I see Stephen and Glenn, and I think
Barbara.
Barbara raised her hand. So
Who's
how about
first?
Stephen? We'll start with you.
Okay, what is our present sea level rise? Have you measured, has it been measured?
It's been about 8 inches over the last 100 years or so, Stephen, for the Gulf of Maine.
I just want to say something. I'm approximately 3 blocks from High Street. I'm on Lafayette Road. And I have 4 subholes that I pump. Okay, I've noticed this year that I've gone through a lot more pumps than I usually go through, that I'm constantly pumping. And I understand that sea level rise also pushes in the fresh water, raises the fresh water. So over the 30 years, I have noticed a difference. I just wanted to bring that to your attention.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't really talked about it very much because it's not an area that I know a lot about, but part of this is looking at groundwater rise as well and the impacts of that.
Very important with so many of us having septic systems on the planning board. I have a question for the first part of the meeting. So when you're all through, I want to go back.
Okay. Let's see, Glenn, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks, David. This might be repeating something you already said, and if so, I'm sorry, I might have missed it, but it goes to something that Robbie was asking, and that specifically, I'm interested to know if you've overlaid onto these maps the designated evacuation routes for emergencies, in particular Seabrook Station.
And we did that a couple of years ago.
Yeah, essentially the state highways are the evacuation routes. And so all the state highways are in the model. So I haven't overlaid them on any of the maps or anything like that. But it is part of the consideration that we're as part of this. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And we did consider that in trying to prioritize sites, but I think our problem was that all the sites were on evacuation routes. So it was
okay.
It's hard to prioritize if everything's a yes.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, David.
Sure. And Barbara.
Yeah, David, fantastic presentation, and I just commend you for, I commend RPC for approaching this in this fashion, because this is the first time that you can say to somebody who knows nothing about sea level rise or trends or things of that sort, when you can begin to quantify it for, and I'm thinking obviously of residents and businesses. So my question is, have you thought about the best way to, for outreach to help? And clearly it's not going to happen in one meeting. So
right.
Have you thought about that? Is that part of what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, part of the outreach that we're doing is talking with the individual communities. That's sort of our starting point. We're still working on exactly, as part of the grant, we're required to do sort of 2 outreach events. And we're trying to figure out how exactly that's going to work. One of them is going to be me presenting to the CAW group that Maddie mentioned earlier at the March meeting. I'm on the agenda to basically go through the whole study and tell them all about it and what our findings were. And the other thing, that's where we're still trying to work that out. One of the things we're talking about doing is essentially a newspaper article type of event where we write a newspaper article and try to get that into the local papers and get it published so that people can read about it. We may also try to do something via Zoom or that sort of thing. We're running up against the end of the project and we're trying to figure that out. But this isn't going to go away. We're going to be talking about this, and as we move forward with other projects, we have our long-range transportation plan that we're in the process of updating now. This will be a big consideration in that, so it'll get some public feedback from that as well. So we're not going to just put this on the shelf and hide it. It's going to be out there. And yeah, the ways to try to get this out to the public in language that's understood and is always a challenge. Okay. All right. I guess I'll move forward. I got just a few more slides here talking about, and we'll move into sort of what can we do about this? What approaches can we take to try to mitigate the impacts of sea level rise on the transportation network? And there's really a continuum from doing nothing to wholesale relocation of infrastructure and development, that kind of thing. So there's everything in the middle as well. We look at ways that we can avoid impacts by prioritizing new investment out of the way of where the water is going to be. We can do things that help accommodate the water, increasing the size of culverts, raising houses, raising roads, those kinds of things so that they stay out of the water. We can do things that are more like putting a shell around places where we put up berms and seawalls and those kinds of things to keep the water out. And again, as I said, the most extreme on the right side is sort of relocating and basically moving things out of where the water is or is going to be. So if we look at those actions, and then we apply the coastal flood risk guidance. And the coastal flood risk guidance asks you a couple things about your, and in this case, it talks basically about your plan development. So, you know, what's the risk of where you're developing, where you're putting your piece of infrastructure, where you're putting your house, that kind of thing. And what's your tolerance for that location being flooded? Or what's the tolerance of the piece of infrastructure or development to be flooded? And so what we found is that the level of risk in all these sites that we've identified is pretty high, right? All these locations where the road is, where it's likely to be flooded. So there's a pretty high risk of flooding from sea level rise. And we made a determination early on that the tolerance for flood risk for the roadway network is probably low to very low. There may be some instances where it's not quite so low, maybe a medium kind of tolerance. But for the most part, we feel like the road is going to be there for a long time. It's intended to be there for a long time. The more it gets flooded, the more damage occurs, the more it costs to repair it and keep it in working order. So we have a pretty low tolerance for flood risk. And what that does is it helps us set the timeframes for planning for when we need to expect the water to be in any particular location. And in this map, I'm showing the low tolerance for flood risk and for each of the 25 sites that we've identified, when we sort of expect the water to be on the road surface. And you can see here, this is at the low tolerance for flood risk. You know, Marsh Road, Parsons Road, and Rye here in the middle of it. We're expecting that we're going to start to see water on the road in the 2030s timeframe, another 10 years or so, and then actually inundated somewhere in the 2040s and beyond that. And so you can see for each of these sites, this is the estimate at this point as to when you might see water on the road and the amount of sea level rise at each sort of stage. And this is based on a table in the coastal risks and coastal risk guidance, coastal flooding risk guidance. So by 2030, under the low tolerance for flood risk, you should plan for 1 foot of sea level rise. 2040, you should be planning for 1.5 feet, and so on out to 2100. So you can see where we are expecting those impacts. If you look at it under the very low tolerance for flood risk, you can see all those spots essentially move up 10 years. So rather than expecting to see water on the road in the 2030s on Marsh Road, Parsons Road, and Rye, we expect to see that, in the 2020s, and then closure potentially in the 2030s. And so you can see so this is just what we're planning for. The amount of flood estimated sea level rise under this very low tolerance is a little bit higher each time. So rather than 1 foot, it's at 1.1, rather than 1.5, it's 1.6. But as you get further out, that number gets a little more divergent. Rather than, I think, 2 feet, it goes up to 2.3 feet at 2050. So again, this just gives us our timeframes for what we're looking for. So this helps us understand so that, okay, clearly Marsh Road, 101 access to Hampton Beach are probably our 2 priorities from a time perspective in terms of when they're going to start to see regular impacts from sea level rise. So I'm going to just touch a little bit on the Marsh Road, Parsons Road as an example of what we're talking about for that. So, and this is one of the areas that we're doing a little more in-depth dive in terms of looking at what the adaptation options are. So at 1 foot of sea level rise, you have just an impact here on that sort of more southern end of Marsh Road. This is Marsh Road at the bottom of your screen here. And this is Parsons Road, which is not in the model, joins up to be Parsons Road, which is in the model and is connected to Marsh there. And this is Brackett Road this way in Rye, and Route 1A that loops around Odiorn Point here. All right. So at 1 feet of sea level rise, we just have this one section of Marsh Road that's impacted. There's no houses or development that are impacted at the point. It's just the road as it's sort of wetlands on either side. When you hit 1.7 feet of sea level rise, your impacted area expands to include this small section on Parsons Road, as well as this section of Parsons Road next to the pond that's right in this area. And those all become inundated. And so at 1.7 feet of sea level rise, you start to have impacts on accessibility to the houses in this area and potentially the houses off on this section of Parsons Road in that area as well. So 3 things that we can look at, looking at how can we make changes to the roadway network to accommodate the water. One is you can reconstruct the roadway with materials that are less susceptible to changes in moisture levels and to the flooding. And that will work up until the point where sea level rise pushes water over the pavement surface regularly. But if it's not over the surface regularly, then you can accommodate it by just rebuilding the road with some better materials, thicker pavement, that kind of thing, to help maintain its structure. The other way you can accommodate the water is essentially leave the road alone and just use detours to move traffic around those sections. In this case, you still have issues with maybe potential accessibility in this section of Parsons Road, but otherwise you can move traffic around to get to the other end and to these parts of the neighborhood by using Route 1A or Brackett Road to kind of get to those areas. In terms of things that we can do to sort of resist the water, is one, you can raise the roadway so that the pavement surface is above your expected sea level rise. This, of course, has impacts in that you need to widen the shoulders on the road to maintain that height. So that'll have impacts on adjacent wetlands. Becomes very difficult to permit that type of thing. And you may be creating more damage than you're protecting from by raising the roadway. So that is something that can be done, but in certain locations, it will work better than others. You can also put in berms, basically solid walls to keep the water off the road. Again, that is going to push the water elsewhere and maybe further onto people's properties. It may be pushing it onto other roads. So that's all something that needs to get looked at. But it does have impacts outside of just the road. In this case, we also have a retreat or relocate option, I guess, where we could abandon this southern section of Marsh Road without really impacting anybody to any great degree. As there's no houses on this section, something would still need to be done in this area of Parsons Road and this area of Parsons Road, but this section of marsh could be abandoned and basically let it flood and let it go without any major disruptions. When you get to the 4 feet of sea level rise, however, we start to see impacts on Route 1A in several locations. And so that changes the dynamic a little bit because suddenly we've lost Route 1A as an alternate route. And access to some of these neighborhoods potentially via Route 1A becomes tenuous. Potentially they're isolated even. Particularly this area in Rye has got flooding to the south of it, flooding to the north of it, flooding further to the north and flooding even further to the north. And then also Parsons Road and Marsh Road here being flooded. So it's really a challenge to get into that area. So you have a potential isolation there. What we've talked about, and when we talked to DOT about this location, they have real concerns about being able to keep Route 1A open long-term due to wave action in this area. It's not just water coming out of the marsh here on the backside, but also water coming in on a regular basis with direct wave action hitting the road. They're concerned that it may not be viable for them to maintain that section of Route 1A long-term. So what do we do in this case? Well, maybe we talk further about reopening Marsh Road and Parsons Road to be able to connect back up to Route 1A here via Brackett. And so we think about, okay, well, how can we accommodate the water better on Marsh Road's Parsons Road? Maybe bridging or building a higher causeway in that area. Apparently, according to our UNH researchers, culvert redesign and improving the water flow in that area, it won't help because of just the sheer volume of water there and other site conditions. I left this, oops. Forgot to take this line out about using parse roads as an alternative. If you close Route 1A, maybe the option is to open Marsh Road, Parsons Road, as that's an easier location to maintain long-term, is basically what the gist of this is. We could probably elevate the pavements of those roads above the expected sea level rise. Again, it would have impacts on adjacent wetlands and properties. And again, you could use berms to do the same thing. And so the end result at 4 feet of sea level rise might be to plan to abandon Route 1A around Odiorn Point and use Brackett Road and Marsh Road, Parsons Road as sort of the new 1A in that location. And then so this, trying to look at this sort of a dynamic system where in the short term, at lower levels of sea level rise, you're closing Marsh Road, Parson Road and using 1A, but long-term, you may be thinking not keeping 1A open and reopening Marsh Road, Parsons Road. So it's sort of a, how do we approach that going forward? And working with DOT on trying to determine whether that's a viable option or whether you just stick with, trying to keep Marsh Road, Parsons Road open all the way through, or whether you let it go for a while until you need it again as the flooding gets higher. Okay, and that's just a little sample of sort of the adaptation options. We're going through each of the 10 priority locations and doing that kind of work. Again, the Marsh Road Parsons Road site is getting a little more in-depth analysis than many of the others, but that's where we're looking at. I've got just a couple more slides, but I wanted to just make sure, see if there were any questions about what we're doing in terms of adaptation options before I dive into the very last little bit here. Barbara, I see your hand up. You muted though, Barbara.
The area that you are just describing, the Seacoast Science Center is there, which is a quite valuable asset. So I'm just mentioning it as maybe they need to know.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a little bit of time before this happens, but at some point we're going to have to make, it's somebody who's, a little higher level than me, I'm sure, have to make some decisions about how we address these kind of concerns, because with the extent of the water inundation on the road in, basically this whole length of 1A around by the Odiorn Point boat launch in this area, that whole area is underwater, and this whole area is underwater. And that is not insignificant to try to keep open in terms of cost. And so at some point we may need to make financial based decisions about what we do. And, that's not for me to do. That's probably the legislature and the governor at the time making those decisions. But yeah, it'll be interesting. Because that's up and down the coast. We're seeing the same thing. I mean, Rye Harbor, same thing, where we've got inundation on both sides of it. So you won't be able to necessarily get to Rye Harbor or Hampton Beach. These are all very important pieces of our communities, and we certainly don't want to just abandon them. But we have to, there may be a point where we're forced to make decisions about that kind of thing. And I'm hopeful we can address things early enough that we maybe don't have to make a lot of those decisions, but you all know how things are and how they go.
David, a lot of those facilities that you just mentioned are part of the state park system. Yep. Is that group involved in your circle of discussion?
Yeah, no, actually, that's a good point. We have not talked directly to state parks about this. We've been basically with the Coastal Zone Program and the DOT, our two main points of contact at the state. But that's a good point. It would probably make sense for us to reach out and have one of these conversations with state parks, just so that they're aware.
Yep, agreed.
They can't be oblivious to it.
I would hope not.
Oh, they could be.
Oh,
I mean, there's been conversations in around sea level rise issues with state parks in Hampton Beach related to the Ocean Boulevard improvements that are being planned and the Hampton Harbor Bridge. So I know that they're not completely ignorant of the topic, but we have not talked to them directly about this project, and that's a good point.
and we've been talking about this for the past 4 to 5 years.
Since 2019, we've been working on it. COVID really kind of stretched things out a lot. So
I have something to talk about. Hello.
Stephen.
I know you said you haven't gone this route yet, but we have a 155 unit subdivision coming before the planning board in Greenland in a few weeks. This subdivision is down close next to the Great Bog in Greenland. Now, if there was a time to raise, and they're having a community septic system with community leach fields. If there was a time to raise this system, now would be the time, I would say. But what do you think?
I would say it'd be easier to have the system built at the level it needs to be built. If as opposed to trying to raise it later on, that would be my take on it, but not an engineer, nor am I a land use planner.
What kind of figures can I throw out? Raise it a foot?
I don't know the answer to that. It's going to be, I would hope that the engineers that are working on the design for the project have done a hydro analysis to look at where the groundwater level is now and what they might expect to see based on sea level rise. I think I want to say, and maybe Tim, I don't know if you know this, my memory of the amount of groundwater rise in this coastal area, including a substantially inland, is about, I think, 25%, something like that. Does that seem like a right number? It's not insubstantial. So it hopefully, and that would be a great question to raise to the planning board and to the engineer who's designing this, whether they're planning for that groundwater rise. And
piling for the buildings too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen, what I'd suggest is maybe getting us the plan, if you could, if you want to include us. I don't know if it's a regional impact type project, but if you can get us the plan, we could take a look at least and see where it sits in this bathtub model. I may or may not have groundwater information, but to your point, I think one thing that we got to think about, and one thing that I hope comes out of this study, is that at some point as a region, we need to agree that we're all going to work to either 2, 3, 4 feet of sea level rise for our planning. We got to all get to the same page.
Yep.
Because we can't have one community saying, nope, we're going to just design and build our septic and roads to 2 feet with others going to 4 feet. We've got to have that executive level decision for the state to say, all right, we have a comprehensive plan of how we're going to approach this issue. So, but Stephen, get me that information if you could, and I'll see if I can get somebody on it for you to take a look.
Yeah, I haven't got it yet. But
Okay.
I will want to get it.
All right, thank you.
I do have another question on the first part of this, so don't forget me.
Okay. All right. If there's no other questions at the moment, I'll just do my last couple of things, which are really talking about what's next. And then I'll just 2 slides here, I think, and then I'm done. Next slide, we're finishing up our community meetings. I meet with both RYE, the RYE Hazard Mitigation Plan Development Committee on next, Wednesday, and a meeting with the chat group for Hampton on Tuesday, I believe, or maybe I'm reversing those. And so those will finish up the community meetings that I need to have for this. We're working on developing site profiles for each of the 25 locations identified under the 4-foot sea level rise scenario. We are continuing to refine our traffic analysis and keep continuing to sort of look at that and try to identify, different areas of impact. We have to include some discussion of the 6-foot sea level rise impacts, even though we can't actually model it. We are refining the adaptation analysis for the 10 selected locations. We've got a draft of that done and a draft of the in-depth analysis, look at the 2 sites, which again are Lafayette Road and Hampton. So Route 1 in Hampton, between Hampton and Hampton Falls, and then Marsh Road, Parsons Road, Route 1A area in Rye. We'll be finalizing our public outreach this winter. Again, using both the CAW meeting as one piece of that and some other yet to be final decided event or writing document as part of that for the second piece, and finalizing it for March 2022 when the contract for this ends. And then beyond this project, we're going to be integrating the findings from this into looking at potential transportation projects in our long-range transportation plan. We're working on refining our project selection criteria in regards to coastal or resilience and resilience planning as part of that in our project selection process. We are working with UNH, and Tim mentioned the study looking at pavement impacts of inundation and sea level rise. Part of that is funding for us to make some improvements to our travel demand model to incorporate some of these local roads that aren't in the model now. So we'll be working on that. My hope is that we can conduct, using our travel demand model, we can isolate individual locations and shut them off sort of one by one and see what the impacts are of just individual sites and what's that sort of impact, so that maybe we might have a better handle on, if we have to make choices between locations, keeping one location open versus another, maybe we can see what some of those impacts are. At some point, we'll have to take another look at this. Once we get the state hydrodynamic model complete and able to run, it's going to give us some different values, and we'll need to take another look at this. We're always looking for additional grant opportunities to do sort of further analysis and design, ultimately engineering. I know the town of Newcastle is working with the county conservation district, right? County. Yeah. To look and do an analysis at the Neil Pitt Lane Lavender Creek culvert there on Route 1B. And so, that's a good first step. We're going to be involved in that project at least a little bit as well. But with the recent passage of the Infrastructure Act, there's a number of programs in that where we could apply for competitive grants to get funding to do the engineering and design work on these sites, or at least some of them, and do that sort of next step to get us a better understanding on what it might take to get some of these places addressed. And so we're sort of looking into that a little bit more. Having this project done actually puts us in a really good position to get some of those grants. So we're hopeful that going forward, we might be able to do that. So, and that's really it. I'm the main contact on this project. So if you have any further questions or any, I know Stephen has one that he wants to ask now. But other than, if after this is done, if you have something that comes up that you're thinking about, feel free to give me a call or send me an email, and I'm happy to answer the questions about it. So with that, I'm going to stop the share. And then I know Stephen had a question, and then I don't know if there were any others that were out there.
Should I go now?
Yeah.
Well, I'm from Greenland, New Hampshire. We're a very small town, 3,500 population. Over the last 40, 50 years, we have abused what little wetlands we have. I'm trying to get that turned around because we have 50% of our residents are on wells. And of course, when you test a well, they're not testing PFAS, but they're drinking PFAS, and they don't even know it, and they're getting sick, okay, except for the ones that are using bottled water. And I'm not even sure that bottled water is any good, because when you call up to try to get some tests for bottled water, they won't send you any tests because they're not testing their water. But anyway, that being set aside, this is my problem, okay? When I try to protect the wetlands, I have problems with the other men on the board. They call it property rights. People have individual property rights. So I have a big fight on my hands, and I'm all alone, and I need help.
Okay. Oh, Tim,
Sorry,
did you have-
Yeah, no, I had unmuted. Again, Stephen, I think, the best thing maybe to do would be to maybe I could have Jen, she was on this call for a while, Jen Rowden, get together with you and myself, and we can just sort of walk you through some of the, support that you should be able to access through New Hampshire DES. For the laws that are in place that recognize that, and we'll try to give you some of the best guidance and some of the information that we have on, educating the naysayers, for lack of a better word, as to the function and value of wetlands and why they're important, particularly in communities that rely on groundwater. There should be enough resources here that we can provide you. I'm not saying I'm going to be able to convince these folks, but we can at least arm you with the information and give you the support that you need.
What's right is right.
Yep.
So
Thank you.
again, I would reach out to us, Stephen. Come on, you know where we are, and next week or two, let me know. We can set you up with some folks to help you out.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other?
Anybody else?
I'll wrap it up then, Rich. I just wanted to let people know that, first of all, thank you for joining us on this. I hope it was informative. It was a great presentation by Maddie and Dave, I think. And so moving forward, we probably have to meet at some capacity in person next month to do some actual transportation planning administration work that we have to take care of. So we're going to try to work out the details on that. But I'm likely to try and do another, depending on where we're at with COVID. If we can get together in March, we'll do that. But if not, we'll do some sort of information session like this, likely on our regional housing needs assessment, because hopefully we'll have a little more progress on that when we get to the March timeframe. So that's what we have coming up, and I appreciate everyone spending the time tonight.
Tim, can we have this available for the next go around?
Yeah, this particular.
So people can look at it and
No, we're recording and
digest it.
Yep, we should be able to get it posted up on the website next day or two.
Yep.
This was interesting. You have a lot more work to do. That would be also interesting to all of us, especially on the planning boards. And where we have wells, it's very important. From years ago, we had meetings where raising a house, and I make sure the houses are all raised at least 18 inches and 18 inches of foundation showing. And that happened years ago. We had that meeting, and this was a good meeting. I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. That's all I have, Richard.
I'm listening.
We don't have to adjourn since it's really not a meeting technically, so we can just say goodbye. And
It's past 1 o'clock.
it is.
All right, I'll stop recording now.
Thank you. Happy New Year, everybody.